Welcome everybody to our Slug focused webinar that Quorum Sense is running. There's a few new names on the attendees, so if this is your first time on a Quorum Sense webinar or anything Quorum Sense, welcome. My name's Sam. I manage Quorum Sense as of late, which is slowly increasing in terms of what that looks like, and we've got a hopefully an increasing amount of activities like this that we're going to be running throughout the year. We had the idea of having what we called the post-harvest debrief, thinking we'd make it an annual event where we'd turn up to initially a Canterbury arable farmers farm and get everyone together and talk about how the season went and what people had tried and what they'd learnt. And then COVID happened, so we've taken it online, and we're doing it over a series of webinars, and we've done 2 of those so far in the last 2 weeks. And the slug topic featured quite strongly both times, and Simon had the good idea of focusing a webinar solely on that, and we're lucky to have Abie Horrock from FAR, who's well known to lots of the Quorum Sense group and to Simon Osborne in particular, who's a bit of a local expert on slug management. So it all came together really nicely. And this time of year, especially with a bit of precipitation which is coming down in Canterbury today, slugs are obviously a high risk thing that we should be managing. So hopefully this is useful for everybody, and it will be recorded, or we are recording it I should say, and we will share it on YouTube so that everybody else can have access to it that's not here today. If anyone's is raising questions later on in the webinar and doesn't want to be featured publicly on YouTube, just let me know and I can edit that out later on. On the subject of the YouTube, if you haven't seen the previous couple of arable focused webinars with Nigel Greenwood or Dave Burkett, you can find them. We've got a YouTube channel which is Quorum Sense NZ, or if you go to the quorumsense.org.nz website, you'll find the link to that YouTube channel under the resources page. We've also got a webinar there from Hamish Belsky recently on post-drought grazing management, and also Angela Clifford last week from Eat New Zealand talking about opportunities for regenerative in the local food supply chain, which was quite a fun session. So yeah, what else do I need to mention? If you're new to Zoom, the way that we've been running these webinars, is in this instance we've pre-recorded a conversation with Simon and Abie a couple of days ago, which I'll play back to everyone shortly. It's 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Down the bottom of your screens, there's a little panel that shows up when you move your mouse around, and there's a Q&A box there. So if you click on that and type your questions in there, we can do a mix while we're going through. Abie and Simon and others can answer those questions and type in responses if they want, or we can save them for answering once we finish the recording. We'll probably have a good 20-25 minutes hopefully at the end there to cover off that, and that's been probably one of the really been enjoying those Q&A sessions, so don't hold back. And if anything technical happens that you need to make me aware of, just flick a message in that chat function and I'll see that come up as well. So yeah, as far as the who we've got today, so Abie Horrock, who you'll see on your screen there, thanks for being part of this, Abie. Abie is a research manager at the Foundation for Arable Research, and has worked with a lot of the farmers, a lot of the arable farmers that I know in Quorum Sense at the very least, and has been part of some of our activities to date. And Simon Osborne is one of the co-founders and current board member of Quorum Sense, and he introduces himself in the recording, so I won't go into too much detail there. Abie and Simon are partners in crime from 15+ years ago, so there's some pretty awesome learning coming from them, so thanks to you both for putting the time in. And yeah, without further ado, I think I will share my screen and play this video, chuck some messages in the chat function if you can't hear it, and sit back and enjoy, and we'll see you all again in 40 minutes. And as James Halford's kicked off, keep those questions coming in. And the two of you have a fairly long history of monitoring slugs, and do you want to talk a little bit about that, just so that we understand your history before we crack into it?
Yep, I can start off on that one, Sam. So back when in the crop and food days, when I was working at Crop and Food, when it was Crop and Food, there was a Sustainable Farming Fund project that was trying to look at getting a handle on the different sorts of slugs that are an issue on crop and farm, and also trying to assess whether we have enough Caraba beetles and predators that can contribute to an integrated pest management approach to controlling slugs. So that was back in 2004 through to 2006, and Simon was one of the farms that we were doing the slug monitoring at. Yeah, so that was when I first met Simon, and it was around slugs.
Right on. Cool. And Simon, do you want to, well, I suppose most people here will know you, but maybe some people watching it on YouTube later on might not. So would you like to just tell us a quick little bit about yourself?
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm Simon Osborne, obviously, farming just probably 2 kilometres away from Lake Ellesmere, only 10 metres above sea level, at the bottom of the farm. We're 280 hectares of arable crops and graze some sheep in the wintertime on our cover crops. Been no-till here. My father started no-till here about 45 years ago. And so got quite a long experience of chasing slugs around the place and learning about what they do. And it was always good when people came along and wanted to study them. And yeah, that was when I first met Abie and Tabitha, and did some interesting work and learned an awful lot, and still learning.
Okay, cool. Thanks for that. So we thought we would structure the session by starting with Abie and her giving us a bit of an overview, just of slug management in general, and all the tips and tricks and learnings and observations that you've had over the last, what is it, probably 15 plus years, Abie. And yeah, then we'll cut into, we've got some videos from Simon of the monitoring that he's doing at the moment, just as an examples that we can discuss, and then we're pretty keen to talk about what to expect in terms of slug pressure and slug management at different stages, depending on what kind of system you're coming from and what kind of system you're trying to move to. We'll try and point. Yeah.
No, I think I'll just start off by just talking a little bit high level around why slugs are such a wicked problem, and have been for a long time and will continue to be, I think, going forward. It's essentially because they're continuous breeders, they are prolific breeders. In a very short amount of time, they can go from being non-detectable to being a huge problem, and they can basically sit dormant and wait for the conditions to get moist enough, because everything with slugs is driven by moisture more so than temperature. And very quickly, they can start reproducing. A grey field slug can lay up to 1,000 eggs. So if you can imagine going from just having 1 slug per square metre, in a very short space of time, you can have 100 slugs per square metre. And the reason why I start off saying that is because the whole premise behind getting in front of the game with slugs is to manage them early, and in situations where you're seeing large amounts of slugs and slug damage, it's really hard to manage them well at that point. You really just have to chuck a whole lot of baits at them, which, you know, that can work, but A, it's expensive, and B, if you can get ahead of the game with your cultural management controls earlier, then you just it's less of a nightmare, I suppose. Simon will probably talk a bit more soon around kind of what to expect when you're transitioning from, say, for example, a cultivated system to a less tillage or a no-till system, because that's a pretty interesting trajectory, really, of what can happen in the world of a slug. And I think probably Simon is best placed to talk about that, but we can come to that later. So yeah, like you made the point before that maybe this little webinar might have been best a month ago, and if you haven't, any time's good. If you're drilling your crops now, that those latest on autumn crops that are still going in, doing the monitoring to get a handle of the slug pressure, it's better late than never is my point, but that preemptive management is really what everyone should be gunning for going forward. So I think what I'll just touch on is that not all slugs do the same amount of damage. The part of the point of monitoring is to get a sense of what sort of slug pressure you're up against, but also ultimately to also see what slug species are there, because they do a different extent of damage in terms of how much they eat and what an issue they can be for your crops. So I will share my screen now and go to just pull up a PowerPoint. So that project that I mentioned before from back in 2004, some of the work we did then was really just trying to get a handle on which slug species are the bigger pest. There's four main slug species that you're likely to find in your crops. None of them are native. They've all come in. We do have native slugs in New Zealand, but they're not really the ones that you see in the cropping system. Sorry? Oh. And yeah, so there's four main slug pest species that you will find, and I'll actually go through them in a moment. But first, I just wanted to show that. And hold on. They do a different amount of damage. The grey-field slug, which is the most prevalent slug that you're likely to find, and the keeled slug, they can do 30 to 40% more damage than your brown-field slug. And there's another one called the Aryan species, which I think is probably more likely to be involved in sort of residue breakdown. It's the farms that I would find the slug is where there was usually residue retained. So they have different, I guess, ecosystems where you're likely to find them. So how you tell them apart, it's actually pretty easy. The grey-field slug, which is probably the biggest issue, has a really milky, white, mucousy sort of slime. So all you need to do is just prod it or just disturb it in any way, and you'll see that this white, milky sort of liquid appear on the outside of the slug. The other key pest slug is the keeled slug, Milex scogates. And when I first started doing the slug monitoring, didn't see much of this in the South Island, but slowly its numbers are creeping up, and it's a lot more common now. It's a lot bigger slug. It eats a lot more and has really apparent ridge or keel down its back, so it is quite easy to spot. Another very common slug, which is less of an issue but still a problem, is the brown field slug, which is usually pretty consistent in its colouring, and it has a very clear mucus if you disturb it. And then finally the Aryan species, which is small slug, one that I mentioned before, that is probably more correlated to that residue. This is a residue, and it's got a little yellow foot. Look under, it's sort of goosebumped on the top, the little yellow foot underneath. So I do think it's worthwhile, as you're doing your monitoring, to just to get your eye in to see which species you have as part of the process. I'll just quickly comment on this slide before going back out to talk with Simon a bit more about the control side of things and the options in that space. But this here is another graph coming from that same project. And we also, alongside assessing what slugs were there and what crabbed beetles were there, we compared an IPM approach, which is integrated pest management approach to managing pests, to a conventional, more of a routine calendar spray approach to pests. And just wanted to see what effect that would have on the crabbed beetles. And you can see here, this is 3 farms from Waimate, that there were a lot more of the crabbed beetles active where IPM management was being used. And just essentially that's because not only do some of the less selective slug baits kill the beetles, but also, which actually, to be fair, those methiacarb baits aren't really on the market anymore. But it's not just the slug baits, that's the broad spectrum slug baits that can kill the beetles. It's also the other organophosphates or synthetic pyrethroids, which are broad spectrum in their activity, that can also kill these crabbed beetles. And I'll just show you a few pictures of them. This is the 2 key ones that you can find and that I found in that Canterbury monitoring. The generalist predators, they don't just eat slugs, they will eat aphids and other pests and other non-pests. They're native to New Zealand and they haven't evolved like some of the England's crabbids that specifically eat slugs. These guys will just eat whatever they can get at, but they can certainly contribute to slug control. They can, this particular one here, the green, metallic green beetle, will eat all sizes of slugs and slug eggs. Some of the smaller crab beetles might just be able to eat the eggs or some of the smaller slug stages, but of course they can all contribute to control. So thinking about keeping them active in your system is really key. And that really just means thinking about what chemicals are going on, looking to use the monitoring, selective inputs. And if you think about that transition from no-till, from cultivation, to direct drill and retaining more residue, sure, you might have greater slug issues, but you're also creating an environment which is better for these generalist predators as well. So though they might not be there immediately, they do come and build up over time, so can certainly help contribute to that slug control. So yeah, that's sort of a bit of a blurb around a whole range of things. Is there anything sort of specific, Sam or Simon, that we could talk about more?
Yeah,
more targeted way.
Could you put that slide up of the numbers you counted here, Abby, during
yes.
that research, please?
So I think I'm really looking forward to hearing Simon's views on how his approach to monitoring his transitions over time, because I think I'll just add that a lot of people really want a threshold or a magic number that they can say, well, how many slugs, what's the trigger point or the threshold set to action. And thresholds are really tricky because they don't take into account the myriad of other things that are going on in the system, or the beneficials or predators that are in the system. So they are a guide, and I'm not saying don't use them, but what I think you need to be focusing on while you're monitoring, whether you're using just your eye or tiles, slug mats, is you're looking to how the numbers are tracking over time. So you're looking one night and you've got a certain number of slugs per square meter or per tile, and you come out 3 or 4 nights later and those numbers have escalated, then that is what's informing your decision or your baiting decision making at that point. Is looking at how are those numbers tracking, are they maintaining, are they going up, are they going down, and again, using those cultural controls, which I think we'll hopefully touch on a bit later, often a preemptive and sort of management decisions that are done beforehand. But if you're in a situation where you're trying to get that crop established, especially if it's a susceptible crop, like a white clover or seed ryegrass or brassica, and you have a slug issue, then at that point, really, you have to bait or resort to some response if that's going to get some immediate control, so that the numbers don't keep escalating and you don't have to re-drill, re-sow the crop. So, yes. Simon, did you want to comment on this graph, or?
Just a couple of things, Abie. What size were the tiles that you were using in this research?
So those tiles were, they would have been, I'd have to look to see the exact number, but I'd say you probably would have needed the slug mats that we're recommending now are 0.25 square meters, so you need 4 of them to get a square meter figure of slug. These tiles were smaller than that, and I've checked the numbers, but I think you probably would have needed about 6 to get the equivalent to a square meter.
Okay, so they're 50 centimetres by 50 centimetres, essentially.
Yes, I'll have to check that. Yeah.
And so
maybe
can you just comment on that, on the what we're seeing there on the numbers that you found here?
Yeah. Yes, so these are trends over that period of time from 2004 through to 2006. It really just highlights a couple of obvious things, that slug numbers fluctuate depending on the season, and that really is driven by moisture. Autumn and spring is when you're going to see those peaks of slugs, and autumn is typically the time of more concern, because that's when your crop is sitting at in that risk window for a lot longer. The crops take longer to emerge. They're vulnerable for longer. So autumn really is the key time of slug issue. Spring can be as well, but generally the crops will get out of the ground quicker. So the predominant slug species here is the D reticulatum, which is the grey field slug that I showed you before. So that's by far and away the most prominent species here. There is some brown field slug, and then that little Aryan, that smaller yellow-footed slug at Simon as well. And again, I think that was because of the residue that was being retained at the site. And yeah, the numbers actually weren't really that high. 10 per slug for a direct drill system was certainly, from memory, higher than the cultivated sites that we were also monitoring slugs at, but not as high as some of the other direct drill farms that we were monitoring. So, yeah.
Right. Thanks.
Awesome. So I suppose we've got a few options that we could do. We've got some of these videos showing, and also this photo here. So Simon, just sing out whenever you think it's most appropriate to throw those in there. But do you want to talk through your experience over time and sort of just summarise what you've learned and what you've observed?
I think initially when we first went no-till, we got absolutely thrashed by slugs, and we used a lot of copper sulphate sprayed out to control slugs, and we were using a triple disc drill, just a Duncan 730 actually at the time, which was I think their very first attempt at a triple disc drill, and it just left a lovely side compacted shiny slot, and it was perfect because it reduced root development in the developing plants and created the perfect situation or environment for slugs to just cruise along and not have to really come up into the dry too much. So we changed to a hoe tine drill and developed various other strategies to deal with that. One thing I think, if you could put that photo up, Sam, please. This sort of the soil chemistry and physics, or the physical state of the soil. You can see here this photo was taken a year ago on a farm that I purchased 3-4 years ago, that have been in horses for half a century. And it was like a sort of a conventional grazing situation where you never had more than about 3 inches of grass and never had more than about 3 inches of roots. This particular soil is a heavy clay, and it's 50%, has a 50% base saturation of calcium and a 22% base saturation of magnesium. It's the kind of place that you break a spade when you stick it in the ground because it's so damn hard. But it just illustrated to me, because I sort of moved past the point where slug problems had been catching me out, to this situation, which was quite exciting to relearn and quite depressing to see what happened as a result, and just how difficult it was to control. But this is what can happen in early transition. You just get an overwhelming number of slugs. And I guess what we did, copper sulfate was really the only way to get on top of that, and then baiting once it reduced. But the features of this soil are, it's an absolutely beautiful soil, and it's had nearly 10 tonne of lime to the hectare since I took it on, and it's just starting to get to the point now where it's behaving itself as it should. Just a complete lack of residue in that soil and a complete lack of root mass in that soil. And I think where I think I've seen problems, or where I know I've seen problems, is where those calcium levels are low and magnesium levels are high. And I don't know whether it's got anything to do with calcium or just the effect that calcium has on soil structure. So I'm not sure about that. But also the lack of this lack of soil residue just means that there's a lack of arthropods, I suppose, that are going to be the predators that take away that egg source that leads to obviously high slug populations. And I think this is a key point further down the track, is to have that soil surface ecosystem is the best possible way of stopping explosions of slug populations, because if you've got a good range of creatures living in that what we call duff layer, they're going to be consuming. There's a lot of predation that goes on, and slug eggs are cleaned up, and I don't know. I mean, yes, carabid beetles are good at eating slugs, but actually in an arable situation, it probably takes them most of the season to colonise the paddock, and whilst they contribute to slug management, they're never going to be a total answer. So I think we need that predation of eggs. That's the opportunity to control or to manage slugs, to keep slugs at a manageable level. I don't use tiles anymore for slug monitoring, although in saying that I do occasionally put one out just to calibrate my iometer. One thing I would say I found useful when I was using tiles is to put it out in the paddock and then come back the following morning and squash, make sure you completely squash, because they are actually quite hard to squash, all the slugs, count them, and then put the tile back in exactly the same place again, and just keep doing the same, and you'll find out just what sort of a problem you've got. If you keep getting lots and lots of slugs every morning, then you've got a pretty serious issue to deal with, and you'll need to manage accordingly when you start putting your crop in. Strategic baiting. Nowadays, I will use peas, as you'll see and will have seen, I'm not sure in the videos that I've put up, that pea stubble, pea straw is probably my biggest risk area, but it's not necessarily because of the pea straw, but the crops that are sown afterwards, such as the ryegrass and clovers, are slow growing in the autumn. And as that temperature starts to reduce in the autumn, slug activity stays reasonably high. I don't think they're overly affected by temperature in the autumn. but the plants grow slower and slower as the days get shorter and the temperatures get lower. So you've got a double whammy in terms of slug numbers are increasing, but the rate of growth of the little plants is decreasing. And so a small problem can easily overwhelm a crop such as that. I've never really had too much trouble with planting wheat, even in wheat stubble in the autumn, because wheat's planted about now, and it's usually probably 5 to 10 degrees colder than it is at the moment. And slug activity does, I think the breeding cycle slows down from here on in, and the wheat is less affected by cold temperatures, so it tends to grow through. It's a more robust plant. But the one key feature with wheat is you need to keep the slugs away from the seed, because if they window out the growing point of the grain, it's not going to come up at all. So whatever you're doing when you're drilling, you need to make sure that the slugs can't get in the row. And so, I've developed a system of planting for that to minimise that risk, and we don't tend to have too much trouble. So when I plant the peas, because in the spring, peas can be particularly vulnerable to slugs as well for that same point, though even sometimes I'll just make a divot in the seed, which can lead to, I believe, increased disease pressure in peas, and not the above ground diseases, the below ground diseases. So you can end up with weakened plants going right from the word go. So just I often use a low rate of slug baits, even though there might be a very light slug pressure. But what that does seems to, in my mind, and my theory is that it reduces the number of, it knocks the number of adults right from the start. So you've got less of a build-up of population through the season, and it leads to a lower risk in the autumn. I've definitely, I think using small amounts at strategic times in the year can actually help build in quite a resilient management system for slugs. And in the spring, you've got the opposite. You've got a bit of headroom in the spring, because the slug takes a while for slug populations to build up. And if you're in early, your crop's up and away before the pressure comes on. If you're in late, you can really get caught out. Winter cover crops definitely help, and we've always used cover crops of some description over winter, but the diverse species makes a huge difference, and I presume it's just a more robust food chain in the soil, and you've just got more diverse range of creatures living in the locale that you're concerned about. So, I think those are just a few simple rules of thumb that I've sort of learned over the years to help me manage the situation. But sometimes you can have the likes of linseed is really, really not susceptible to slugs. And interestingly enough, I had the first time this year on the horse farm where I actually had to bait linseed, because there was absolutely nothing else left, and then they went for the linseed. So they will take it if really pushed. But interestingly enough, after linseed crops, the linseed leaves the soil in such amazing condition. For some reason, we just have much, much lower survival rates. I don't know what, but we have much lower slug pressure after linseed than we do after pretty much any other crop. So that's, and with the wheat stubbles, when we double mulch and get all the mulch on the ground and plant cover crops into that, so that's probably happening late February, early March, don't seem to have too much problem there either. I have only probably once in the last 5 years had to put slug baits again on the horse farm and an autumn cover crop after wheat. So that's, I think soil structure and that magnesium calcium ratio, although it's highly controversial, it's something that really seems to pan out on my farm anyway.
Anything you want to comment on that, Abie?
I would just say that there's never going to be a one size fits all. Are you talking about the ratio or just in general? Because I don't really know much about how the calcium magnesium ratio will affect slugs, but really, if that's what you're seeing is happening, then the anecdotal information I think is really important. Just, even if you don't understand the whys of it at this point, but
I think it's to do with. Really, I think it's to do with the soil structure, the soil condition, Abby. I don't necessarily think it's anything to do with calcium and magnesium per se. It's just how that leaves the soil.
Yeah, and that's what I was. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Is if you do have a good soil structure, you've got good nutrition, anything that's going to get your crop having all its defense mechanisms working and getting out of the ground quickly is going to be beyond helpful in terms of just removing the plant from that really vulnerable stage of being hit by slugs. So yeah, good nutrition and good soil is really important for those reasons. And I'll just add that with all the different management options available, and there's quite a lot of them, preemptive ones and post-drilling ones, there is no one size fits all. And so, as everyone's will have their own scenarios about what works for them, and that's why I think this Quorum Sense platform for farmers to share their experience and talk about what works for them is so important, because you can save yourself a heck of a lot of time. You can learn from what someone else has tried that might work for you, because there is just never going to be a one silver bullet strategy for what can work for slugs, because every system is different. And there's a whole lot of, like you say, golden rules and rules of thumb, which I think are really key. And talking about them can certainly help fine-tune the management of slugs. And that good soil seed contact is really a good one. And the nutrition, soil nutrition is important, and sort of what can be done prior to that susceptible crop being sown, because that they just their numbers can explode exponentially really quickly. So just you can get in front of them or flatten that curve earlier, then you're just going to be saving yourself a whole lot of trouble later on. And yeah.
Love how you got the flatten the curve in there, Abby.
I know. I think everyone understands what flatten the curve means now, more so than they might have ever done in the past. So I'm going to use it.
Yeah, I think it's quite paddock specific, actually. I mean, even at a farm scale, different paddocks behave differently. And I think just the important thing is to learn that monitoring, get your eye in on how things are happening on your farm, and how the numbers in different parts of different paddocks as well. Some areas of the whole 90% of the paddock's fine, but there's one area that just constantly gives trouble. And it'd be great if we had loads of money to throw at it and find out what the hell's going on. But it's just, you've got to learn to monitor and get your eye in on what the population you have actually means in terms of potential risk for you.
Yeah.
Just to wrap it up, I wonder if we want to kind of cover up and try and summarise, and perhaps Abby, you have a crack at this first, in terms of what those kind of key things are from a preventative systems perspective that we can do. Like, so monitoring, obviously we've talked about, that's key there, but what are the tools that are available to farmers as proactive strategies, and then what are the different reactive tools that we've got to play with? And then obviously some of them are going to suit different people. I know very little about this, so
well, I think the thing is to learn how to monitor, and learn to quantify the problem on your own property, and learn the basic identification of the slugs and understanding what they're doing. Then identify what your vulnerability is, like what crop are you planning to put in. And I sort of categorise the clovers and the grass seeds, which are autumn sown, are your highest risk in the autumn, cereals less so, and then in the spring things like peas, probably beans, and are the most vulnerable. And then you've got your cereals, and then things like Phacelia and Phacelia and linseed are quite low risk. Not that there's great areas of Phacelia grown, but they tend to be less susceptible for some unknown reason, or unknown to me anyway. So I think just getting your eye in on the monitoring, and then baiting, using, I think using an EDTA bait, I just think that's the best way to go as far as baits are concerned. And if you've got a really severe problem, you have to try and marshal under control. Then you get into the area, spraying copper sulfate at night and just de-sliming little buggers. But that's sort of getting to ambulance material. Looking at crop rotations and just building up. Yeah, the transition point, the transition phase is the trickiest from tillage to no tillage, because you've got to build up of problems before you've got a build up of solutions. So there is an increased risk in that area.
Anything you'd add to that, Abie?
That was perfect, Simon.
Yeah.
No, I absolutely agree with everything you say there, and getting your eye and knowing which areas of your farm are problem areas, and susceptible crops, and especially those susceptible crops, starting that monitoring early, so you know what you're dealing with. And again, like the decisions you make across your rotation, everything is going to affect those slug numbers, whether you're grazing residue or whether you're cultivating or condition of your soil. Like all the nuances of what you're doing on farm in various ways will be having effects on those slug populations. And just getting your eye in as to how those decisions implicate on those slug numbers and in those susceptible crops. Starting that monitoring early and the management early, so that you're just not going to end up with the ambulance at the bottom of the hill scenario. Around the baits, yes, I agree with Simon. The iron phosphate or the EDTA baits, the formulations are so much better now than what they were 10 years ago. And yeah, they work pretty good, and the lightest touch sort of bait in terms of the effect on beneficials and soil biology and what have you. So I think Simon really summed things up brilliantly with what he just said. So I just agree with him wholeheartedly.
One of the other things is just really making sure when you're planting seed that the machine you use or the way you do it, make sure that those slugs don't get down into that seed row. Because if they can get down into the seed row and they can move easily down there, they're not going to come up, and they're a lot harder to control if they're not up on the surface. If you can leave your drilling job in a situation where your seed's nicely put in the row and out of the palm's way, you never stop them completely. But if they can travel along that seed row, you're really in trouble. And this year being a dry autumn, and those of you who have clay soils, there's going to be a lot of cracks, and that's a lovely place for to over summer out of the dry down in those cracks. And 2 weeks after that first autumn rain that gets things going, that's when you really want to start watching, because that's when you'll get egg hatch and you'll have lots of baby slugs coming along.
Righty. I hope everyone managed to keep up with that. That's my third time watching that through, and I picked up probably about 30% more than I thought was there. Hopefully those of you with a bit more experience in an arable system, it will have fit in a bit easier. In case some of you aren't aware, there's been some questions that have been coming through that Q&A, and Abie and Simon have been answering them, just typing in answers there, and you can look at those if you open that Q&A box and go into the answered section there. Was there any, Abie or Simon, was there any questions that came through during that chat that you want to touch on briefly? And I'll just encourage people to keep those questions coming if you've got more.
I'll just touch briefly on Simon's questions about the seed treatments and whether they affect the crabbed beetles. If you remember the graph that I showed in the PowerPoint presentation, comparing an IPM to a conventional approach and the impact on the beetle numbers. So there's a lot more beetle numbers on the IPM approach, but all those crops had had a seed treatment, so it wasn't IPM to the point that there was there was a bare seed. So I think what I'd say to that, because the chemical is removed from where the beetles are active, it's not going to kill the active beetles. But what I don't know is what's happening below ground, because the larval stages of all sorts of predatory insects like rabid beetles are all below ground. So what impact those seed treatments are having in that space, I can't comment. But just in terms of the adult active beetles that the seed treatment is removing, it's not going to kill the beetle. The beetle isn't going to be eating the plant directly and getting knocked back by the neonicotinoid.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks for that. I mean, for me, just having listened to it 3 times now, the takeaways for me really that kind of soil health, when you're talking about calcium, magnesium, that I just keep coming back to some of the soil health workshops I've been to, talking about functional calcium really making a big difference for worms, and worms having a big impact on soil structure, and I think worms being one of the predators of slug eggs and that kind of stuff. So that kind of thing all fits really nicely in my head from building that soil ecology and sort of principles around diversity and diverse ecosystems being really resistant to pest explosions, no matter the type. I actually saw Dave Mitchell commented earlier on about a farmer in the UK who went no-till and I think pretty much no chemical in that, and noticed that his slug pressure was the least on the outsides of his paddocks where he had, I assume, permanent pasture strips or something along his fence lines or whatever, and migrated inwards, which would, I suppose, aligns with those IPM strategies in terms of, I know in Europe they use wildflower strips and all the likes of that I've seen as well. Has that been tried at all in New Zealand, Abie? Or Simon?
Yeah, can you hear me, Sam? Or?
Yep.
Yeah, oh good. Just learning how to use this thing. I did that with Steve Ratton back in the 90s, early 90s. We planted the predator strips around the outside of the paddocks. They were actually a pain in the ass in terms of the cropping scene, because of course the first round around the outside is the biggest round in the paddock. But we just ended up going and using our fence lines, because I still love my gorse fences, and you have your rough grasses growing in underneath your gorse fences, and I don't spray any fence lines. And so we're getting that same function, and Steve did some work with pitfall traps that and collected lots of insects. It showed that we're having a similar effect as what they were trying to achieve in the UK with that. So just making the use of those areas that you can't economically utilise as part of the farm system.
I just add to that sorry, I missed the beginning of the question, Sam. I was reading the other questions, but in terms of beetle banks, you can have the best beetle bank in the world, but if you're still doing various things in your paddock that kill the beetles, then it doesn't really make any difference. The generalist predators, they'll live in your paddock. They'll be eating a range of pests and non-pests and all sorts of things, and that's where they're going to survive. And the essentially resident predators are there all the time. They don't like the lacewings and the hoverflies. They'll fly in once the food source is there. For example, aphids. That's not the case with the resident predators like the rabid beetles. They live in your paddock. So sure, a beetle bank or companion planting on the edge is useful, but it's what you do in the paddock that really is going to have an impact.
Awesome, and that's related to a couple of questions that have come through. One from Collier asking about what type of arthropods target the slug eggs, and James also asking if flatworms eat the eggs.
So flatworms are predators, but they're not like earthworms eat soil, and they might, my understanding of this is that they might eat slug eggs during that process of digesting an enormous amount of soil, but I don't know that they seek them out. And if anyone has a different view on that, then I'm interested to hear that. But my understanding is it would just that's not what they'd be seeking out so much. Whereas the flatworms, that they are they're predators. They dissolve all sorts of things, and that's how they survive. Earthworms, probably slugs, and yeah. So that would be my answer to that. And other arthropods. There's probably all sorts of things that eat slug eggs that haven't been quantified. So I know obviously that the beetles, not just crabbed beetles, other beetles can also have a go at slug eggs. But I'd say that they might be a food source for a range of things. So they are something with pretty good mandibles, because slug eggs, I don't know, when you squeeze a slug egg, you'd have done that, and they're actually pretty hardy, and they take a bit to squish. So I don't think, they've got pretty good defense mechanisms going as well, so they wouldn't be tasty to everything.
Cool. Nigel's got a question. How about secondary poisoning, which I assume is related to like seed treatments, neonic seed treatments in particular?
Yeah, no, I don't. I mean, that grass that was at before, the crabbed beetles were alive and well on those in those paddocks where there had been seed treatments. And I don't think that they would get enough of a toxic of a hit when they are eating. They might have to eat an awful lot of the pests that have eaten the plant, that have come into contact with the systemic with the neonicotinoid to have an effect on them. So my understanding, my feeling to answer that question, Nigel, is no, I don't think so. But yeah, I might need to look into that a bit further, because it could be cumulative and have other chronic effects as opposed to acute effects.
Cool, thanks. I think we answered your question, Peter, around other environments that are beneficial for predators. So you said perhaps the fence lines, and I think we covered that off about 30 seconds after you asked it. And then I suppose obviously in your situation, Abie?
I was just going to say the crabbed beetles are active at night. I think oftentimes people don't see them, so they think that they're not there. But if you've got a lot of residue, especially if you're direct drilling, if you're not using a whole lot of the broad spectrum, if you're not using the thiocarbon baits, which no one really does anymore, and if you're not using a lot of SPs and OPs, you probably do have a lot of those beetles active in your paddock, and you just might not know. Like they're active at night. You might not see them. It doesn't mean that they're not there.
Awesome. Nigel asked about which birds eat slugs, if any. And I know that Peter Backus posted on Facebook today. You obviously saw the advertisement for that, and one of the things he suggested was spreading a bit of feed maize around the paddocks if you got ducks around, and put them in the right place and they'll do the job, which I think that American film that came out on that big kind of, I can't remember what it was called, where they filmed it for 7 years, transitioning a desert basically into some kind of permacultural oasis. But ducks and slugs.
That's actually interesting, Sam, because I've got some guys here that keep control of the game birds around the place, because they're being so close to the lake, they tend to visit us fairly regularly, and they can do quite a bit of damage. But one thing they never find in the crop, because we often open the crop up when they're shooting and have a look and see what they're actually eating, and we've never found slugs in their crop. So I'm not quite sure. Maybe our ducks need training or something, but there's no evidence that they're eating them here anyway. But magpies are a pretty good indicator species that you might have a problem. If you've got a whole bunch of magpies sitting in one place in the paddock, it's probably slugs that they're eating.
Must be a bit too much other missed grain in your area sitting on the ground for those ducks.
Oh, you got to feed the birds, and the shooters love it. So
yeah. There's a question here, Dave Mitchell, and I'm glad this came up about using lime and salt ground spread after sowing, and we've had a couple of conversations on the WhatsApp chat, and I wonder if actually this is just an opportunity to cover off the range of different tools that you have used, like we haven't covered off rolling, or even just sheep grazing at certain times to try and reduce populations, for example, and then some of the more, I guess you might call them semi-experimental ones that farmers are playing with, such as the lime and salt stuff.
Yeah, everything has its pros and cons. I've never heard of lime and salt and I'm not sure that it's something that I would try. But I don't know. I just don't know about that. Sheep grazing can be a double-edged sword, or having lots of animals for their footfall. In a situation where you're not in permanent pastures and that topsoil in wet conditions is just a little bit more vulnerable than it might be in a well-established pasture on a cropping farm, you can do as much damage and I think create conditions that favour slugs to survive. And what's happening to all those little predators and things that are running around as well. So, any sort of big guns, heavy intervention, I'm not really in favour of, and we don't really use any of those. I think it's more about creating an environment that favours a balance and having as many living things there as you can to create that balance. I think crop rotation is important. I think soil physical condition, as I discussed before with the calcium magnesium ratios, just for soil structure. What crops you're going in after, some crops cause a build up for whatever reason, and some crops run populations down. So there's not really a one size fits all answer, but just a careful use of all the resources you have at hand. I think for me, I don't have any severe problems with slugs anymore, and I think that probably just because our soil health and soil structure and everything's building up over time, and we always keep that good layer of mulch on the soil surface. So I'm only fighting small fires nowadays. And on that photo I showed with all those slugs on one side of the spade and all the earthworms on the other side of the spade, that was just out of one crack in the ground. And it's actually crop rotation that I've used down there. I've just avoided planting things that are susceptible in situations where there's high numbers. And the one thing that I've really noticed over all the years, if you've got a soil that is deficient in whether it's root mass or organic matter on top of, semi-decayed or foliage or whatever on the soil, that's when you get problems. It's those really depleted paddocks that are the ones that give really severe problems. So it's working away at building up that root mass, that decaying root mass, and having plenty of mulch on top of the soil. Those paddocks that I've taken on down there, they're just eating everything I can throw at it. It just disappears so quickly. It just doesn't seem to have built to a stable point yet, and we're still having issues there with slugs. So it'll be interesting to watch that as time goes on. So I'll stop waffling now and let you. Yeah.
I assume the cautions around something like grazing with sheep, for example, is the same for, we talked earlier or a couple of days ago about the use of a heavy roller for squashing slugs is in dry situations where you're not likely to cause compaction, for example, lower risk. But if you've got risks of compaction in that situation, which might be similar conditions to issues with sheep grazing, for example.
Well, I heavy roll after drilling always, but that's for two things. One is to knock any stones in the ground so they don't go through the header, but the other thing is to close up those just to close off those seed rows so that the slugs can't get in there, and the birds. It's not usually a problem in the autumn when the soils are reasonably dry, but in the spring, and I only use a half full roller at the most nowadays because you use a water ballast roller, but and sometimes an empty roller just to flatten the surface. I don't know if you've ever tried to squeeze a slug between your fingers, but they can take an enormous amount of pressure before they get damaged. And I'm not sure that heavy rolling, I'm not convinced that heavy rolling would actually make that much difference. But then, we saw examples on the WhatsApp this year where they were, absolutely thick on the ground. And I guess when you've got that many, you probably certainly can have a useful effect.
Abie, you were going to jump in there?
Yeah, really just to say that all those cultural methods have got to be strategic, and they don't always work. And then you made the point about the rolling when it's really wet. The trade-offs there might be too big. Strategic grazing can have a really important part to play, but as Simon covered, there's trade-offs there. Cultivation kills slugs, burning kills slugs. These things that are, you know, that extreme end of your cultural control kit, which obviously have other trade-offs too. So there's a number of things going on there, and that there is no one size fits all. I was just going to, I don't know if Simon Lockhead is available, but I had an interesting chat with him, really just talking about the importance of closing, getting a good drill slot shut, close off after drilling, as a really key cultural control. And he might want to comment on that, and his experience with linseed, which I think was might have been different from Simon Osborne's. Not sure if Simon Lockhead's there and if he wants to comment, but I was just interested because I think he had quite a different experience with the slugs after linseed, but maybe a conversation for another time. Yeah, so just...
Cool. Well, we can do it. I was just wondering, we've got a few videos from Simon of his monitoring techniques. I wonder if we just sneak one of them in now, and we'll pick up a few more questions, and we'll just wrap it up and aim to be done by 9:15. If that sounds good. And yeah, have a flick through those questions while this is playing. And I'll just pick one.
Ryegrass planted on the 14th of April with Phacelia and crimson clover as companions. And this is what I consider to be my sort of most vulnerable slug danger here, or my most vulnerable crop as far as slug danger is concerned. So this is just planted into unprocessed pea stubble, essentially. There's quite a bit of material here, and you can see here I've opened up, and just right here we've got a slug straight away. Now this paddock has been baited, and I'll have to do it again, but sometimes where you've got piles of residue like that, they'll just sit under there and they'll never come out, and they'll just eat their way through. There's a wee plant there, there's a damaged clover there, so we've still got, that's the exception as far rather than the rule in this particular crop. But crimson clover, which we have right here, will show the damage first because it comes up probably a full week before the grass. So I'm using that as an indicator. And when I'm doing my slug monitoring, I'm always digging like the birds do under these lumps. And here's a family of slugs living right here. It's probably quite difficult to see them. Oh, there's a greebly sitting on top of a slug. I'm not sure what he's doing, but there you can see that one there that I'm digging out of the ground, and they're all quite small. So we had to irrigate this to get it to grow. But there's a whole family of the little buggers there, and they're cleaning up that row. But it's really quite difficult to get bait in there. So that's an exception. Here's some more slug damage on crimson clover. Now this is just one patch in the paddock that I'm watching here, and I'm using it to illustrate the point. If the whole paddock was like this, I'd be racing in and getting some serious baits on, but there's only patches, and here we are, not far away, perfectly fine, and I can see the rows along there. So
yeah, so that was just one of 4 videos, and we can probably maybe at 9:15 I'll play the last few for anyone that wants to watch a couple more. Any of those questions, Abie or Simon, that you've been looking at there, you want to take a crack at?
I was just going to comment on the Metrex. The question was for Simon, so Simon, I'd be interested to hear your opinion too. But that's the active metaldehyde, which is pretty much on the way out in lots of parts of the world because of its detection levels in water, and probably what happens elsewhere in the world will happen here, and at some point it's likely to no longer be available. It is it's doesn't kill the beetles. There's no secondary poisoning issues with the metaldehyde formulations. I think there's potentially a good fit for it as part of the dealing with slugs in those really high number years, along with the iron phosphate baits, because they have slightly different, I guess, formulations or functionalities. So that's my opinion. I think I would go towards the iron phosphate baits as a preference. I think they're lighter, have a lighter touch, but I wouldn't rule out the metaldehyde baits completely. That's my thoughts.
Yeah, my thoughts on metaldehyde pretty much the same as Abby's. I don't have any particular expertise in the area, but it would worry me that what's happening in the waterways and it's getting away off the farm, so that's sort of not really ideal. And I think the EDTA doesn't seem to have any collateral damage, so I prefer that. I'm just having a bit of trouble sort of reading the questions and concentrating at the same time.
I can read them out for you.
Yeah.
There's a couple, one from Roger and one from Louis in relation to nematodes. So one from Roger relating to cover crops being correlated with a reduction in slugs. Is there a correlation there with nematodes damaging the eggs? And also a comment from Louis. There's a nematode, which I'm not going to try and pronounce the name of, infecting and killing slug that's been available in Europe as a biological control for the last 20 years.
Yeah, we have, so recently, and I can't comment on the cover crop question, but the nematode question, there's a parasitic nematode that's particularly parasitizes on slugs, and it has, there's a number of formulations where it is available. Recently there was work done here to see could we bring it into New Zealand, and we had to make sure it wasn't on the new organisms list to be able to bring this organism in. And so when they did those assessments, I think they found that there are background levels of this parasitic nematode already here. So there is no problem with bringing in those baits, those biological controls. The issue with them is that they're extremely expensive. So a scenario where it could be affordable to use it on a cropping system is pretty unlikely. I don't know the costs, but it would be, I think, a lot more than $60 per hectare, I think. I think it's sort of priced out of the broadacre systems, and might be very high value crops or agricultural systems where it's got a place. That's what I know about it.
Yeah, I don't know anything about it, but again, it just comes down to balance. If if you're working towards creating a healthy soil ecosystem, and for arable farmers, that's a particular challenge because we have so many interventions in our soils that we're constantly knocking it back. But that's got to be the goal, I think, because that's where you're going to get that biological. You're going to leverage that biological benefit and get the most out of it. But I mean, I don't really see a point in time when I won't be using slug baits necessarily. There'll always be the odd situation, but it's got to the point where it's minimal, and that must be to do with building up resilience in the soil ecosystem, I think. And that's the. I think we've been trained for so long that if something goes wrong, we reach for a can of something or we reach for a bag of something. And it's actually just thinking about what we're doing in our farm systems and how do we build those to be stronger and more resilient. And that's what this whole thing is all about, is building in that resilience. And I think, as I said before, it's around just having as much of that plant material in the soil and on the soil as you can manage. Dave asked a question. I see he put up a question. Dave Burkett asked a question about moisture levels and soil conditions at drilling. This year is particularly interesting because it's. I don't think we've had a dry year like this probably this century. In the autumn, I certainly remember them in the 90s, but it's sort of a bit of a unique situation because at the moment I'm planting into what appears to be completely dry soil. But the crops, apart from ryegrass, which I watered to get it going, but the wheat crops seem to be all germinating and striking
and getting away. And I don't think the slugs have really sort of woken up yet. So it'll be interesting to see what happens once we get a bit of rain. If we get a bit of rain, might not be till June yet, and see what happens then. But the slugs in that video in the grass seed, none of them were in the soil, none of them were in the seed row. They were all in that surface residue. They were all living in that area that's sort of got plenty of moisture and shelter from the sun, but they hadn't gone into the row. So yeah, the crop was able to get up and away, and I was able to control the slugs.
Brilliant, thanks for that. Dave Burkett also just made a little suggestion here that he also uses half-filled spray containers instead of tiles, because the water in the container keeps the soil damp underneath. So that's a cheap DIY lesson.
Right.
And I also think that FAR can provide slug mats. Is that right, Abie?
Yeah.
So
just follow up if you would like some slug mats.
Yeah. And there's
And
also
they're not the be all and end all, but they're certainly an indication of slug activity. So part of the management process.
Brilliant. Cool. And Nigel will probably take Nigel's as the last question, and then I'll just thank everyone, and I'll just play these last couple of videos of Simon's for anyone that wants to hang on. Diatomaceous earth as a tool. I think Nigel put about 5 kilos out from memory. Correct me if I'm wrong, Nigel. With one of his crops this year. And obviously that's a lot of, well, I know that the home gardeners like diatomaceous earth as a tool, and we've actually been using it a little bit in our garden here, keeping them off the brassicas, and it seems to have worked at significantly higher rates than 5 kilos a hectare though. But any experience or research on that, Abie or Simon?
None. I can't comment because I'm not aware of anything in that space. So I pass on that one, Nigel.
Diatomaceous earth is really good for controlling segmented insects. So if you've got grains, if you've got bugs in your grain silo, it's pretty much 100% effective way to control them. You wouldn't want to put it anywhere near bees because it'll be fatal to bees. And I'm pretty sure it certainly won't affect slugs. It won't affect their health and well-being anyway. It may keep them away, but it won't kill them.
Interesting. My thinking there goes to something that could go down a drill slot, but that's just me speculating. Cool. Hey,
well, DE is used as a carrier for a lot of biological stuff.
Right on.
So it's already going down the drill slot.
Yeah. Cool. Brilliant. And hey, well, thanks for that. I'm sure this group will continue to trial different ways of managing slugs for years to come, and hopefully we can keep up this open sharing of what's working and what's not, and perhaps even with your help, Abie, being involved, actually run a few more sort of monitored trials of the things that seem to be showing promise, so that we can actually kind of communicate these things with a bit more confidence. Would be really cool. I know that's something that we talk about quite a bit, is just doing some of that kind of real basic but quite valuable on farm trials and getting that out there. So thanks to you both for taking the time to do this. It's been fun. I've learned a hell of a lot. I hope everyone else has. And I hope.
Cool. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Simon.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Thanks, Abie.
No worries. And so I'll play a couple more videos, just if anyone wants to hang on and have a look at Simon just explaining a couple more of the things what he's doing. If not, have a great evening and have a good week. Okay, we'll go that one.
Establishment of crops into pea stubble is, in my view, my highest risk as far as slugs are concerned on this farm. This is wheat that was sown about 5, beginning of the week anyway. And we've just irrigated it because it was bone dry. So I'm just monitoring here at the moment, and I'm looking in the row. I just dig along the row and have a look, and I can see there's a little plant that's just starting to do its thing. And here is a slug sitting in the row. I'm not seeing any damage. This was planted with Phacelia and crimson clover. And one of the strategies I employ, if I've even got quite low levels of slugs when I plant the peas in the spring, I'll just whip over them with a part rate of bait, and that'll cut down the number of adults laying eggs in the spring. And I find that really helps in the autumn. So here I've had a dig around, and I've found maybe 1 in 2 meters of row, and there's no hollowing of the grain, which is what you'd expect to see if slugs were getting at the grain. You'd see them hollowing out the growing point, as James showed in a video that he posted earlier in the week. So I'm pretty satisfied. I don't need to take any action here. The next most vulnerable point will be as the crop starts to poke through the ground, but the crimson clover and Phacelia will come up first, and they'll give us an indication as to what's going on in that respect. Comment about soil surface residue and slugs. There is a lot of discussion around the fact that having residue on top of the soil creates the perfect environment for slugs, and that somehow you're going to have more slugs in that situation. I don't think that's been adequately proven, and to me, the residue, yes, the slugs will sit up the top because they don't have to go back down into the soil if you've got surface residue, but the eggs will actually be laid in the soil. The ones laid in the residue are incredibly vulnerable to predation. And the other thing is that soil surface residue creates the perfect environment for lots of predators and things that are likely to eat slug eggs. So the idea of if cultivation killed slugs, we wouldn't have any. And the surface residue, while it provides an environment for them to stay above ground, that also makes them more vulnerable to baiting, of course, because you can get at the little buggers. But it also provides a huge service in terms of the other critters that can live there, which will predate the slug eggs and other eggs.
Okay, there you go. And just because I can't resist, Tim Porter chucked up a good question I think is worth asking around the detrimental effects of copper sulfate on soil biology. Just as one last little round off. Any takers, Abie or Simon? Pass from Abie.
No, I could look into that, but no, off the top of my head, I'm not sure.
I just our copper levels are quite low here anyway, and so it didn't really worry me. And I think I haven't seen any detrimental effects, but I only used copper sulfate where I had a desperate situation and needed to effectively rescue a crop from being completely destroyed. So I didn't use it very often, but I can't. Yeah, I mean, we're adding copper sulfate to different mixes now to try and get our copper levels up.
Oh, cool. And I think from what I know, you spray it at night, typically at reasonably light rates to try and it's not drenching the soil with it or anything, are you?
No, Nigel asked a question before, at what rate? I think, from memory, I have to look it up, but it was a long time ago, probably 3 or 4 kilos per hectare, I think. And yeah, so you just want to essentially get it on the slugs, and if you can do that, spraying it at night, get it on the slugs, and then the next day if there's a huge number of slugs there, you can certainly whack the shit out of the population.
Cool.
And there's issues with burning too, isn't there? If the rates are too high and it's not done pre-emergence, is that an issue too, Simon?
I was doing it on crops, Abby, but I was doing it at a time of the year when it was cold anyway, like in the early spring or in the late autumn. So it didn't. We never noticed any problems with burning.
Right.
Good thing, good potential to be aware of.
Just as a point there too, I tried. I put what did I use? I was trying to find a way of not using Reglone to desiccate before harvest, so I put on about 4 or 5 kilos of copper sulfate with fulvic acid to try and desiccate the crop, and it didn't work.
Right. Okay. It's not a desiccant then.
So the burning issue didn't seem to be an issue for me anyway, unfortunately.
Really cool. Right. Hey, all, thanks for that. Cheeky little add on at the end there. Have a great week. Thanks very much, and we'll see you next time.
Cheers, Seth.
Cheers.